So I'm out here to talk to you about the role of ecological disturbance in your garden. And I was just thinking about it because I was broad forking the soil, which is when you take a fork and you go in there and then you just pry it back a little to aerate the soil and open it up. And then I was just chopping up the weeds on top. And we're going to be looking at this through an ecological lens. So look at a wild ecosystem and a dry hill like that over there. What's going to happen to disturb the soil? Maybe every once in a while there's an earthquake or something and some rocks fall down. Maybe there's a wildfire that goes through and just burns up a lot of stuff. These things are going to happen in what we call in food forestry and ecology a dynamic mosaic. So there's going to be a giant swath of land, and the forest fire is never going to affect all of it at once. In any given mature ecosystem, although ecosystems don't mature into a hierarchical pinnacle, but if we're just calling it mature, in any ecosystem that's fully developed, about like 5 to 10% of the land is going to be disturbed and brought back to the base stages of ecological succession, and then it'll rise up to the surrounding ecosystem over, it totally depends on the ecosystem. Like for a mature forest, it could take 100 years, but at any given point, only 5 to 10% is below the mature level. And so in nature, disturbance is a thing, and it happens, and ecosystems are adapted to it. They're developed to need that, actually. But when we're looking at something like our garden here, we need to realize that disturbance happens within a certain context. It's not like we're having an earthquake, a wildfire, and a flood all at once, which is essentially what's going to happen if you were to till your soil. And so when we're preparing a garden bed, we need to look and realize that in order to mimic natural ecosystems, we really need minimal disturbance, right? So what is broad forking with the forks? Essentially, what that's doing is aerating the soil, bringing oxygen into it. And a lot of people, in order to accomplish that purpose, will use tillage. And what tillage does is it basically blends up the soil in a blender, and it brings oxygen to all of the microorganism, all the nutrients, and produces a bunch of bioavailable nutrients for the plants for the first year. But if you do that year after year, you'll completely deplete the soil. So in order to mimic a natural ecosystem in this way, we're just aerating the soil with the fork, and we're not inverting the layers. We're not chopping it up and destroying the mycelial networks. And then when I'm destroying the weeds on top, I'm just doing it on the very thin top layer of soil and leaving all that stuff underneath completely intact. And so going back to how natural ecosystems work, it's not a perfect analogy because we're not actually mimicking this ecosystem. I'm building a garden, but we do need to realize that disturbance is something we need to constantly be aware of within the ecology of our garden. And the microorganisms, the soil food web, is not going to handle disturbance well. And really, in the context of gardening, it's not like we need to do a disturbance. This is something that happens in the grand ecological scale, and we're totally doing enough disturbance just by ripping out plants and everything. So we really want to minimize disturbance. So if you're preparing a new garden bed, fork it to aerate it, and you're just prying it up a little. You're letting the stuff that's on top stay on top and the stuff on bottom stay on the bottom. And then just whatever you need to do to get rid of the weeds, do it with minimal disturbance. So for me, that's just taking the shovel and chopping it up. And if you look, you'll see that the soil is pretty disturbed. Like it's all fluffed up, and that's going to give it a nice tilth, which is easier to plant in. However, below that top layer of soil, everything underneath is staying undisturbed. And there is an argument to be made that you need to integrate compost down beneath, and so put some compost on, fork it, and let the compost fall into those holes. And the microorganisms will spread out from there. Do fork every 4 inches if you need to, instead of every 1 foot, which would be more typical if you really want to integrate the compost. And then also have plants with deep roots, and then when you kill the plants eventually to harvest them at the end of their life, cut them at the base, snip, and don't remove the plant. All those roots is just pure organic matter that you're going to let decompose in your garden, and just add a little more compost on top. So yeah, basically when we're thinking about our garden, we kind of want to look at the natural ecosystem, and this can be a guiding framework to help us point to things that we might be doing wrong. But of course, these things have already been discovered and understood, and so we can just know from people who have researched this before us that we want to minimally disturb our soil. And this is something that's going to allow us to create a thriving, alive garden long term, instead of just running through and depleting the nutrients in the short term. And people till their soil because it looks like it's helping in a year. And then we have a whole agricultural system that's dependent on a constant input of NPK macronutrient fertilizers. And it's extremely bad for the ecosystems. Our food has no minerals and nutrients because it's just growing off of these macronutrient fertilizers that are produced through industrial processes. So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for watching. Triple Nipple Nick. Leave any questions below. I will make a video for any question about gardening or anything.